Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pam Laricchia, unschooling mom and author, bringing you interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free Exploring Unschooling ebook, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hi everyone, I'm Pam Laricchia, and this is episode number 28 of the podcast. It's the 12th of July, 2016, as I record this intro. In this episode, I chat with Jen Armstrong about worries and fears that can pop up on our unschooling journey. This episode was inspired by Cheryl P. Recently, she shared with me an observation that I've seen expressed pretty regularly over the years, namely that when experienced unschoolers share their perspectives and stories through books, podcasts, and online, it always sounds like the person presenting never doubted the path they were on. They always had a cool head and never fell into society's trap of comparing their kids to others or holding them to their standard. I totally get what you mean, Cheryl, and it comes up in interesting ways in my conversation with Jen this week. But I want to talk for a minute about an idea that didn't come up. Have you ever noticed that when experienced unschoolers are answering questions, they often preface their answer with, "Here's what worked for us"? I've seen it many times and I've used it often myself. And the reason is that it's what we found works for our family. We're sharing the culmination of our experience, what we learned. But your kids may be different. As soon as you hear that phrase, though, it's a good clue that a lot of personal questions and thought and experimentation and stress and conversations and maybe even fear and worry went into the process of finding that path forward. So, for example, I may say, when Michael started karate, he just wanted to go to one class a week and he wanted to attend class on his own, not have me stay to watch. After a few months, he got more comfortable with the atmosphere and he decided to add a second class to his weekly schedule. We checked out a couple and he found one he liked. That's what happened. Does it sound simple? Easy? Well, maybe, but can you envision all the stuff that went on behind the scenes to come up with that plan? The questions I asked myself and the conversations I had with Michael as we played with the possibilities? Questioning myself about, are we getting our money's worth? About whether he was really interested if he only wanted to go once a week when he could go 5 times. My worries about not being there to see how Sensei interacted with the students, and the feeling of judgment from the other parents about not staying to watch, looking like I didn't even care about his interest. I'm sure there were even lots more things in there too. I don't remember it all. But I did the work and got to the realization that I was meeting his needs, exploring this activity the way that he wanted to, and that was what was important. So that is what worked for us. Michael starting off with 1 class a week on his own and adding another class a few months later when he was comfortable. That's what we learned, and it may well work for your child. So when you see or hear that's what worked for us, it's probably a safe bet that lots of stuff, worries, questions, conversations, failed attempts, and so on, went on behind the scenes to get there. And I'm sure you're welcome to ask for more details about the process if you're interested. That leads nicely into the quote for this week from Marcus Aurelius. "The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. What stands in the way becomes the way." I really love how well this quote ties into our topic this week of unschooling worries. This aspect we do touch on in the episode. One of the early questions I asked Jen is about the worries she had when she was moving to unschooling, and her reply was that at first she could think of none. As we dug into that, we realized that those earlier worries, those questions that were standing in our way, were the impetus to learn more and find the answers to those questions. Those worries led us down the paths where we had learning to do. So looking back, those were learning times, not worries. For example, I learned how Michael prefers to approach new situations. Teresa Graham-Brett and I talked about this in a bit in the last episode as well, about how so much of our learning about unschooling was a result of diving into our uncomfortableness, into our worries, rather than trying to avoid them. What stands in the way becomes the way. In the end, it's not about the worries, it's about the learning. And the fun. So much of it is found in the fun. Don't forget that. And now, on to the interview with Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Jen Armstrong. Hi, Jen.
Hello, Pam.
Welcome. It's really great to have you on the show. Just to let people know, I've known Jen for years, having met her first online and then in person at various unschooling gatherings. I have always loved her perspective on the unschooling lifestyle, and I'm excited to chat with her about her journey and dive into some of the challenges that we can encounter along the way. So Jen, to get us started, can you share a bit with us about you and your family and how you guys came to unschooling?
I would love to. So we are currently a family of 3. There is myself, Jen Armstrong, and I am right now, which I'll talk about a little bit later, I'm relatively new to the world of working 40 hours a week as a child life specialist. Which was part of our unschooling journey and really exciting. My husband, Joe Voss, he holds 2 professions which excite him. One, he's an entertainment lawyer, and on the other side, he's a development person for a creative arts nonprofit here in Michigan, where we live. And Joseph is our always unschooled son. He next month is going to be 16. So he's very excited about the independence that driving is going to afford him. Yeah, so that's really exciting. And I'll talk more about him in a little bit. Oh,
that
and
sounds
then
perfect.
how we came to unschooling.
Yeah.
Because that's why I'm here. So we actually lived in Chicago when I first started reading about homeschooling. And I think the first book I ever read was Family Matters, Why Homeschooling Makes Sense by, David Guterson. And ironically, I was reading that while I was in a master's program to teach special ed. And I ended up not finishing that program because our second son, Isaiah, was born and he had complex medical issues. So I was reading about homeschooling, realizing I didn't want to be in a classroom because I couldn't engage with kids in a way that felt good to me. And then we had our second son who actually wasn't going to be a good fit for a classroom. So we sort of started talking about homeschooling at that point. And then what I really remember as the defining moment of moving towards unschooling, we had moved to Michigan and Isaiah was in different therapies. And there was a session with a therapist where it was a very frustrating session. And the therapist said, he's really just not coloring up to par with his peers. And he was about 4 at the time. And I remember thinking, okay, what do we want as parents for our children? And I really didn't care whether or not he was reaching the same goals at the same time as his peers. And so Joe and I really talked about how we had this child in our lives who was not going to live a lengthy life. And so looking at what we really wanted for our children and deciding that what we wanted was for them to find what made them happy. And I was fortunate when we moved to Michigan to have met Amy Carpenter-Lugs, another unschooling friend. And she pointed me towards the Shine with Unschooling Yahoo group. And so I started reading about unschooling. And that is really, I think, the defining moment of our shift into unschooling.
Wow, that's beautiful. It's a hard story, but what a great way to approach the whole question, right? That it really is setting, parenting as a goal of setting up our kids for their whole life, right? Rather than just trying to teach them these things on the same schedule as everybody else, right?
Yes, because they're not all going to have the same lives, no matter how they're taught and so that's really been the goal, I think, for us as parents.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about Joseph, the soon-to-be 16-year-old Joseph. I was curious what he's interested in right now and how he's pursuing it. And if you can maybe, if you look back, if you can see how that interest has kind of developed over the years. I always love hearing about that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun thinking about Joseph and how I would respond to this type of question. And I actually did check in with him around my view of sort of his timeline of interests, and he okayed everything. So his great love right now is music. He is a bass player in a band that's made up of, let's see, three unschooled teens, and then also they've just had another individual join who is a young man that did go through the regular school systems. And so he always has had a love of music. He's always been the one in the family sort of to introduce me to new types of music. That has been a lot of fun. In terms of how he started playing as a musician, he, for a short period of time, went to a community nonprofit that was called Open Door Center for Self-Directed Teens. And through the director of that center, he connected with her son, who was a musician and a music therapist. And so he was working on getting teens together to play in a band. So he started as a drummer, and then about a year ago, he switched to the bass guitar. And it's interesting to hear him talk about the difference between his interest in the drums, where he noticed, I never wanted to practice the drums, whereas the bass guitar, he has set a schedule for himself where he has certain days where he practices, and then he practices with the band, and now he's writing bass lines. And that love opened him up to other stringed instruments. So he picked up the ukulele and the electric guitar. And just in the past 2 weeks, actually, he said, I think I'd like to learn piano. And so we picked up a keyboard, and that is now part of his daily practice regimen that he set for himself. And so I think thinking of some of the ways he furthers that learning around the bass particularly, he has gone to a lot more live music with his friends and with Joe, because that's a passion he shares with his dad. And so he's been observing other bass players, and he's been reading, Bass Player magazine. And he just now has reached the point where he's thinking he might seek a teacher in order to grow his own skill set. But that all of this learning has been so beautiful to see, and it's all been on him. He has just asked, for the first time, maybe I would like some help seeking a teacher. But up until this point, he has just taken it and run with it, and it's been amazing.
That is so cool. And it sounds so similar to what I've been observing around here too, because Michael picked up the guitar a few months ago, I guess. We've had them around for years because Lissy really enjoyed it for a good couple of years before she moved to New York. And so he had been playing her guitar. And then she came for a visit a couple months ago and wanted to take her guitar back to New York with her because she was missing that. So we went and got a guitar for Michael. We picked it up early for his birthday because I didn't want him to be weeks. There was maybe 3 or 4 weeks between those moments, right? So I didn't want him to have to be without, because all of a sudden he had it for hours and had even progressed to a point on his own where I would hear music coming from his room, and I thought that he was playing, like he was, that he had he was playing a YouTube video or something that he was learning from. And I asked him, and he's like, no, that's me. And then he went, so then just a couple of weeks ago, he went and got the electric guitar that was in Lissy's room and went out and bought there was a couple of strings that needed replacing and needed a new wire for the amp. So he went and bought all those things when he was in town, and he asked from a friend and got a ukulele actually on his birthday. So, and he moved the keyboard that we had in the basement for like 10 years up into his room. So yeah, that sounds so familiar. All the, just how it's just so fun to see how they're, oh, I'm going to try that. Oh, I'm going to try that. All the different connections that are in there. It's so cool.
I think it's really hearing you talk about like the friend that got him the ukulele and going to the store and getting the things that you need. I think there's such a powerful community around music as well. Like the band that Joseph is in, the Cringes, have been playing at this theater here. That's a small local theater called the Park Theater. And it's all ages that go to open mic night, and they get feedback from older musicians, and they have these friendships in this community and this source of support that is so powerful. And so I think that's one of the great gifts around exploring interests, is it's not confined to just one age group or one part of the community.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, what I loved, I was kind of, when I took Mike into, there's a well-known music store in the next town. So we went there, and, I was kind of, you're hoping for a good reception. Well, anyway, it was an older gentleman who owns the store and just loves music and guitars. And he explained. He asked Mike what kind of thing he was looking for. He explained a couple of options, like showed him this guitar has this and this one's this, and you might find this. And, the other thing that was surprising to me is, he was using music language and terms, and Michael knew exactly what he was talking about. Warm tones and all that kind of stuff that I wasn't familiar. I'd heard the phrases before, but didn't really know what they mean. But anyway, so he said, okay, so now you go try them. I'll just be over here. So he and I went off to another side of the store and just chatted. And he let Michael play because he knew that was the important thing, was his feel for the instruments and everything. That was more important than, selling on the features per se.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. And I ended up chatting with him, and his daughter is finishing an art program and was about to go do an internship in New York City. So,
oh,
but that other piece about the community, with unschooling, because they're not like in a classroom in that one fixed place learning this fixed set of, knowledge and skills. That was one of the reasons that Lissy had wanted to look at New York City, because she had, on her own picked up all sorts of skills and information and all that kind of stuff. And she was really enjoying what she knew about photography, but she wanted to expand her, in-person kind of connections, her tribe. She wanted to talk to people more than online about it. And that's what she found. She's like, oh my goodness, I found my tribe. The people who speak that language, the photography language, who they can, sit around for hours talking about all those little details. So that tribe it's just amazing for them to find, isn't it?
Yeah, that is, certainly Joseph has as kind of an end goal moving to New York City because he knows there's such a vibrant music scene. But we are currently in the process of moving from Holland, Michigan, which is quite a small town, to Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is a larger city and has a vibrant arts community. And a friend recently asked, how is Joseph doing with that move? Because in part it is prompted by my having taken this job, which currently requires quite a bit of driving. But I responded, he's very excited because he sees where he can grow through this move. And he likes that he'll have the independence to drive back to the place where his band is and he practices, but then he'll have the opportunity to explore this new place and this new community that will foster his growth in music. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's lovely as all those things, things always seem to weave together, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, even if it wasn't, that thing in particular, there's often things as we start, really looking at our options. There's just so many in front of us. But anyway, I guess we should move on to the next question. And based on our topic this week, we're chatting about worries. So I was wondering if you could share some of the worries that came up for you as you moved to unschooling.
Yes. And I will say I pondered this question for quite a while because it's a testament to where we're at now. Initially, I could think of nothing.
I know.
And then I finally got around to realizing, there were some, and they were, I would say, I really felt like there was a point where I said, let's explore radical unschooling. And we used that term. And that led us to looking at things like when I think Joseph was probably maybe 7, because it was just after Isaiah had died and I was really connecting with the Shine group. And so the 3, I think, worries that really came up for us at that time were bedtime and reading for Joe. Joe had some concerns around that. And then for me, I was a little bit stuck on food. I had been a no sugar mom early on. And I think food in particular, that was one where I took that one to a friend and she recommended a book called Preventing Childhood Eating Problems. I looked it up, A Practical Positive Approach to Raising Children Free of Food and Weight Conflicts. And that really helped me move past that food fear, because really it was fear. And so those were some of the worries that came up in the initial transition to radical unschooling. And so moving into that more respectful relationship between the 3 of us. And yes, so those, once I thought about it, we did have some worries and some fears in the beginning. And I would say those were the 3 big ones.
You know what I find interesting, like, because your comment at first, I couldn't think of any. I think that is like a testament to the journey itself, because, when I put myself back in that earlier time when was learning about unschooling, I do realize that there were, worries, which, as you mentioned, when I dug into them, they were all based on fears, and mostly my fears of, what will happen to them in the future if we do this? Well, and this could be from food to, letting them stay up to, not insisting they learn to read immediately, like all those things. They were there, but later on, when I look back, I realized that, those were the impetus for me to learn about those things. So when I look back, it's like, that wasn't a worry or a problem. That was just me learning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think sometimes that's the disconnect, because when people, are newer to unschooling and they have all these questions and they have all these worries and fears, and they look and they say, no, you experienced people don't seem like you ever worried about anything. I think part of that disconnect might be because, later on when we look back, we realize those were just part of the whole learning process. What they did really was tell us where we had learning to do, right?
Yes. And I would say hearing you explain it that way reminds me of that feeling when I was in that more vulnerable place of learning. And I did feel almost, I think sometimes we can almost feel shame at the beginning, like, oh, I'm feeling frustrated, or I just want them to go to sleep, and feeling like we're doing it wrong, rather than we're still learning the tools to get to this place where we can live respectfully with our kids.
Oh, I love that. And you know what else is challenging about that? As you were saying that, I just thought of something else about that time, is because you're feeling worry, shame, judgment that you're not, that these tools, because you know the tools or the actions that experienced unschoolers are sharing, but yes, you haven't learned enough about them and how they work for them to be working comfortably in your lives. So you still have questions, right? But so you feel, well, if I go to the unschoolers with these newbie questions, that's kind of silly, and you're worried or you feel shame about that. But you also can't go to your regular family where you used to go for questions, because their answer is mostly, well, of course that doesn't work. You got to come back here to us. So you're kind of stuck. So yeah, that's vulnerable is a great word for it, right? That's a time when you can be feeling really vulnerable. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's look at the next question. When we first get started, our children's days are so very different from the conventional childhood, which we were just talking about. And while we have enough of an idea about unschooling that we chose to get started, we're still busy learning so much. Why, look, this led nicely into the next question. We don't have our understanding or experience to fall back on when questions and worries bubble up. So some describe, I remember when I had the very first year of the Toronto Unschooling Conference, one of the speakers titled her talk like this, because that time can feel like we're jumping off a cliff. I was wondering how you would describe that feeling, and that during that vulnerable time, what did you rely on to help you keep moving forward towards the unschooling side?
So I think there were a lot of pieces that helped support me. And on the one hand, I would say having that foundational piece of understanding sort of our purpose in choosing unschooling, which was and is wanting our children to know what works best for their life and brings them joy. So having that as a foundational sort of touchstone to go back to, certainly for me, it helped to have a supportive partner, so that when I did feel like, if I had a moment where I was feeling worried or panicked, he sometimes would step in and say to me the things I had been saying to him for years. And it was helpful to hear my own words come back to me as a support. The real life community, as well as the online community, was very important, particularly when Joseph was younger, to be able to ask those questions and to see how parents further down the line parented. Not that I had to change my parenting so much, but actually just to see, oh, other people are doing this like me. And it felt so good. And then, let's see. I certainly, for me, just because of who I am a researcher. I love researching. I love reading. And so for me, I think having a historical understanding of school and how school came to be, and understanding the science behind learning, the science of play and the importance of play, and the science behind how the brain develops, and that reading is not meant to develop at the same pace for all kids. Those were particular supports for me because of who I am as an individual and how I, encounter the world. I think the biggest thing, though, that kept me always moving forward was looking at Joseph. So taking that step back and just observing him and seeing constantly his obvious learning and observation and growth was always centering and always kept me trusting the process, as we like to say.
I really love that because, you're right. In the end, that biggest piece was seeing my kids in action. Because if I took that time to pay attention, which is always useful, but in these situations, the more I got stressed or worried about things, the more I knew it was time I need to focus on the kids and watch them because, my gosh, I mean, seeing their learning, seeing their, even when they got frustrated about things, it was because they were so determined to do things. And that determination, the way that they, attacked their days just wholeheartedly, no matter what it was that they were doing, all that always brought me back to, right, as you said at the beginning, remembering the why. This is why we're choosing to do this. So, and even in the hardest, because my kids had been to school, I could, even in the challenging moments, look and when I see them compare to what they were like and our days were like when they were in school and saying, no matter what, this is still better, even if it's hard and challenging. And those pieces that you understood already about learning and play and all that kind of stuff, that was the stuff I was learning through my research. So, I found a lot of those same things. That's really interesting. When a worry or challenge pops up in our unschooling lives, it can definitely trigger a fight or flight response. Sometimes if something goes wrong with our kids, we just want to jump in and fix it right away. So often these feelings are based in fear and projecting this moment into the future. Oh my gosh, they're upset about this and they're reacting angrily and, oh my gosh, I need to stop and fix it right now because if I don't, they're going to react that way for the next 50 years. But in that moment, right, when that happens, it can be really hard to recognize that. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how you learned to recognize when your fears were getting involved and making the moment bigger or more panicked than it really needed to be.
Yeah. I actually I drew a little person in response to this question to sort of identify how I learned to recognize my fears. And I found it came down to noticing the patterns of my own reaction. So seeing that I would have panic and my cognitive response, which has come to be sort of a humorous catchphrase for me to let myself know that I'm falling into a pattern again, is, oh my gosh, I broke him. And so now I can know, if this thought comes up, did I just break him? Have I broken him? How ridiculous that actually is as a question or a statement of our lives. And so that is one key or clue to me. Okay, I'm stepping into a place of fear. A second piece of the pattern is looking at how my body is feeling and how often my body is hungry or my body is tired or I haven't given myself time in the woods. And that is a consistent factor for me that comes up repeatedly, not just in regards to unschooling, but in regards to my relationship with Joe or my relationship to the world in general. If I'm not meeting my own physical needs, it is reflected in how I'm perceiving others in my world. And then I think the sort of the final piece is recognizing what emotion is coming up. If I'm feeling angry about something, taking a step back and looking at what I might be where I might be feeling discontent with myself and my own actions, and then asking myself, am I projecting that outward? So I would say those sort of the cognitive, emotional, and physical patterns that play out regardless of whether or not we're talking about unschooling or work or anything where I'm engaging with others. I think it's always useful to identify our patterns of response.
I love that. That's really, really cool. I like the way you broke that out. And I'm looking at the next question. Once you've recognized those fears and how they're wrapped up in the situation, clouding your perspective, how do you begin to untangle them? Now, you did speak about those, so I was just wondering if you had anything else to add to. I still love, oh my gosh, I broke him. What a great way to break the ice with yourself, right?
Yes, it is.
It really, because you're looking at him, you know?
Right. He's clearly not broken. So I think, yeah, I delved into, what is my big ball of fear made up of? What are those tangled threads? And so in thinking back over those moments where the question came up, did I just break him? I looked at a few different things. Is this feeling coming up because a situation has occurred, which when I delve into it, I realize relates to my own childhood experiences and how those were handled by my parents? And that I found was a pretty profound moment. There was an instant and an interaction with Joseph where I reacted in such not to him, but I had to, step out of the house and I was sobbing and I contacted Joe and said, did I break him? And realized that it all boiled down to my own experiences in this realm as a child. And once I recognized that, I was able to see how vastly differently he was going to be able to experience it in this situation where we were parenting respectfully and unschooling and had an opportunity to process and live with it so much differently. I think, let's see, a couple others were being able to recognize if it was fear about or shame about judgment of others. And that one didn't come up as often, but I do think that there can be a sense that because we've chosen such a radically different path, it has to look like perfection. Like, yes, this is the right path, and there's no question. And that's where judgment of others can come up as a concern. So just letting go of that and recognizing that everyone has issues and challenges that come up. And let's see, so something that came up recently, and that is sort of one of the things that comes up for me, is letting my vision, you talked about fear being a piece of trying to see into the future. And I think part of that for me is looking at the world as a whole and letting how everything looks outside of my child impact how I see him. And one of the examples that Joseph and I talked about recently is how working in an emergency room as I do, I see teenagers come in who have addictions to meth and who are really struggling with life. And so I can sometimes see that world and bring that fear home. And so refocusing on who my child actually is and and hearing who he is and not letting that big picture color my view of the reality of who Joseph is. I forgot what the question was.
You did a great job. I love that. It was untangling your fears.
Oh, yeah.
See, that worked perfect.
Okay.
But what a great point about realizing, like your work in the emergency room. But I mean, we can take that into all our lives, as in seeing what is big, even if it's fear of things going on around us, or even in the bigger world, and if we encounter it, it's like the frequency with which we see that, right? And the more we see that, the bigger worry and fear that comes into our head, and it can cloud our perspective or morph it, right? So that those pieces of the world have a bigger impact. They're a filter through which we're seeing things, when in reality our lives are our own, right? And the way we live with our children is very different. So it doesn't. It's to be more clear. Yeah, back to untangling it, so that you're more clear on what your relationship is with your own child, and the relationships and atmosphere in your own family, and seeing things clearly for your family, rather than having all these other bits clouding our perspective, right?
Yes. And that is, I sort of had a fourth thread that I untangled, which the word I used was relationships. So just when those fears come up, looking at the relationship that you have. And for me, looking at, the trust that I have in who Joseph is, and how that started from, a very young place and has grown. And so, yes, relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because you can, that is a really huge piece, the connection and relationship that you have with your child through these moments, even when things, go squirrely or something, that foundation is still always there for you guys. For, the strong connection that unschooling parents develop with their children, to be open to even those squirrely moments, because that's the important thing, right? So often in more conventional parenting, right, they have a set of rules, and the kids know, if I do something outside this set or outside of my parents' comfort zone, I just better not tell them, and I can't go to them to talk about it, right? So then the places that they can go to learn really good information and figure out ways to move through this challenging moment, are just drastically cut. Mostly they can just go to their friends who may well not have any experience. So they're all just kind of spitballing it at that point, right?
Yes. And that's where I think I'm sort of skipping to question number 9, because I think it flows
go for it.
here.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that helped me maintain that focus on relationship, one, because I'm a book reader, I read early on, well before Joseph was a teen, the Parent Teen Breakthrough book by Mira Kirschenbaum. And the one, I have no idea what the rest of the book said. I remember I loved it, but the piece I took away was, really the only thing you ever have with your children going forward is relationship. And that is where the safety is for your teenagers as they move into the world and start experimenting. If you have that open, respectful relationship, they can come back to you and suss out what they think and feel by having you there to listen. And Joseph is in that realm of being a teen and figuring out what works for him and what doesn't. And we had a conversation recently where we were talking about some experimentation, and I we were taking turns sharing, and I shared. And when I was done, I said, thank you for listening to me through this. And he said, thank you for being the kind of parent that lets me talk about this. And that was so drastically different from my teenage years, and such a powerful gift that we gave each other, being able to listen and hear without judgment. And I think about how that, more than anything, helps keep him safe in a way that is, let's see, I don't want to say help keeps him safe, because that is something I don't have the power to do, but sort of starting at a young age with, he's walking on a balance beam, and another parent wouldn't, I remember this situation clearly, another parent wouldn't let their child walk on the balance beam because you might fall, it's high. And me saying, how does that feel to your body? Do you want a hand to hold? Do you want to put your arms out? Are you comfortable? And how that is what has gotten us to this place where he's still asking himself those questions and figuring out what feels comfortable and stable to him, which might not be the same thing that feels comfortable and stable to me, but trusting that he has that skill set to keep himself as safe as he needs to be.
I love that. I could just sit with that for 10 minutes. That is a really beautiful way to express it. Yeah, because in the end, they are individuals. They are real people on their own, right? And what we're trying to do is help them discover that person and discover their ways to, evaluate situations that they're in, to be asking those questions. Do I feel safe? Do I want my arms out, or whatever the options are in any particular situation that they're in, so that they are looking at each moment through their own eyes and from their own perspective, rather than our perspectives and our comfort zones and our safety questions, because as they get older, we are there less, right? So allowing them to experience that control over their autonomy, their choices, all that kind of stuff, and to be able to listen to the cues and see them in the environment and from their own body and their own thoughts and everything, and to be able to put that all together. I mean, that is some high level skill, and that's what we see so often in these older unschooling kids and unschooling adults, and it's really beautiful.
It is. It's amazing. And some of the things that Joseph has shared his thought process around, I think, wow, if I had been able to process things at that age in a similar way, I don't know, life would have felt actually a lot safer, even as I was experimenting and growing. And so it's really beautiful and profound. And it took me a lot longer to reach the place where he is in thinking about his experiences. So it's really beautiful to see.
Oh, I know. It's amazing. And it's one of those things that, you can't, until you're living it and seeing it with your child, it's hard to understand and or believe that would even happen, right? Because we're so, I talked a lot with Teresa Graham Brett about that last week, that we just don't see kids that way. We really, conventionally, we feel to be a good parent, we need to control so much of their lives as they're growing up. To be a good parent. That's what the messages tell us. And that, if you explain to others what the kind of parenting that we're doing, to them, it looks, neglectful and uninvolved. When you're actually in it and doing it, it's just amazingly connected and strong.
Yeah.
Here's one particular question or worry that I hear of quite often. So I wanted to pass this one by you. And I think most of us have gone through it, times when we found ourselves questioning whether we're doing enough, whether we're creating that solid unschooling environment for our child or our children. And I was wondering if you had experienced that worry over the years and how you moved through it.
That is definitely something I've experienced over the years. I think not as much when Joseph was younger, because he, at that point, did have a lot of interests that he wanted to be involved in, and we had regular park days, and so it didn't come up as a worry as much when he was younger. I can share a recent example. As I transitioned in February into working full time, that fear came up for me. Joseph gave no signs of not having enough in his life. So this was definitely a fear centered in me making this big change and worrying about how it was going to impact the family and taking it all on myself. So I actually just asked Joseph, how are you feeling about this? Do you feel like you have enough in your life right now? And expressed my concern about how my working was impacting him. And he shared that he talked about actually needing the time that he does have at home in order to sort of refill his tank. And he talked about the different pieces of his life that fill him up, which go from the music and band practice and playing once a week. And he's working on training the dog. And so that takes up a piece of his time, and reading, which has sort of continued to be a place where we find humor, Joe and I, because Joe has continued to have sort of this wish that Joseph would pick up novel reading. But he knows that he has that, and it's his own wish because he knows he gets joy from it. But Joseph has always been a big manga and graphic novel fan. And so recently he started reading Moby Dick because of a graphic novel he had been reading where it was referenced. Pardon me. And so he, of his own volition, is really filling up this time that I was worried I was causing him to, in our heads, we have this picture of our kid just sitting there, which is so far from the truth. He has both a vast external life and a vast internal life. And I know for myself how important that is. And sometimes I think we forget how important that is for our children and teens as well. So I think when those fears come up, it's good to shut the fear off for a second if we can, and look at how our child is actually showing us that they are content, as opposed to letting our fear color what we perceive. And then we certainly can always ask, is there more you would like? Or invite is always a good thing. Would you like to go on this walk with me, or to see this live music, or to, one of Joe's passions is film, and he invites Joseph into that world. And basketball recently, which is a language I don't really speak, but the two of them have a whole life around basketball that's really cool. So I think, again, stepping back, looking at the child that's in front of us and not who we think they should be or how full their lives should be, and actually seeing how content they are.
Content's a great word for that. And again, like every time we've been chatting about it with fear, so often that's what worked for me, was looking back to the child, because fear and worries meant that I was getting caught up in my head, right? Yeah. So looking at my children and seeing their lives, that always helped me center and focus on back to the why, focus on why we were doing this in the first place. And I love your idea about, inviting them, because sure, you can say, well, because, when they're busy with that internal life, you can't see a whole lot going on, right? You don't know. So if you invite them along to something, that they would enjoy, or that they know you enjoy, and they might want to spend some time with you, if that by inviting them, and if they being totally okay if they say no thanks, that gives you a clue that they are content, that they're occupied with something, right?
Yeah. And I think for me, going back to talking about sort of that big ball of fear, and recognizing that one of my triggers was what I needed physically, I think when I start to worry there's not enough in Joseph's life, I have to step back and say, oh, which of my needs am I not meeting? And am I projecting onto him? Like, do I need to go sit in the sun for 5 minutes? Because he is clearly content, catching Pokemon on PokeGo. And maybe I need to step outside. That doesn't come up as often. And when it does now, I can say to him, oh, I'm projecting onto you right now. I need to go do this thing. And we laugh about it. And he's like, yeah, you are. But that comes from a place of having had those conversations all along, and me saying, oh, here's where I'm at. And I'm sorry that I projected this onto you. I'm going to go meet this need. And, you're welcome to come, but there's no pressure there.
And I think that's great. And you know what? We learn that from them, don't we? I was going to say, that it's great that we can go off and do our things, and they're perfectly okay with that. They understand that we have, we need some quiet time, or maybe we need some, out and about time, or, need to go check out a bookstore for a while, whatever it is that, we're feeling that we need to do. They're so okay with it, aren't they?
Yeah.
And that's where I learned it, from watching my kids and realizing, oh, look, they had this need, and then they met it and everything was fine. I guess I should start taking care of myself too, like they do. One of the other challenges that many unschooling parents experience revolves around their spouse or their partner, because usually one parent will take the lead in unschooling and parenting, which means that they're the ones, able to watch and observe their children all the time. They're the ones learning more deeply about it. They're actively engaged in the day-to-day unschooling lifestyle, so they're getting comfortable with it. And that dynamic often leaves the spouse or the partner feeling disconnected and out of the loop. So I was wondering if you could share your experience with this.
We definitely experienced this. And particularly early on in the sort of first few years where we had moved into radical unschooling, and where fears came up for my husband around things like reading. And I would immediately become defensive in those areas, because I was the one that had done all the research and sort of led us down this path. And I can still remember, we were at dinner with friends who were sort of new to the unschooling path. And so we were out as couples and having this conversation. And I think Joe brought up a concern, a fear, and I became very upset and defensive, and recognized he was able to help me recognize that when he brought up a fear, what I actually heard was not what he was saying. I heard, you are failing us as a family, which is a really hard thing to hear. And thankfully he reminded me, you're not in this alone. You're not carrying this family alone. We're in this, all three of us, as a family. And so then once I started to believe that, I didn't take responsibility for the family as a whole and how I was failing it, but I was able to hear his concerns as valid because he's this unique individual. And I would say then that we were really able to, from there, move more fully into living respectfully with each of us being unique individuals with needs. Whereas before, I think I had felt like unschooling means you only look at the needs of the child. And so it was really hard for me to hear his needs. And that did lead to him feeling really disconnected. So coming to a place of understanding, oh, we all have needs, and we can navigate that with respect for one another, was a really good thing for me to come to understand in terms of letting him be a different parent, because we are vastly different parents. And that can all fit within the realm of respectful parenting and unschooling.
That's awesome. Yeah. You know, when you talked about we're different parents, I remember how that was a huge shift, a huge realization for me at the time too. Because even, I would see some of his interactions and I might cringe or feel, that the impact that could have, on the kid, that they could feel it as judgment or whatever. But when I realized to look to the kids, they weren't taking it that way. They knew his language, his way. They had their own. That's when I realized so strongly that they had their own relationship. And I knew that they would speak up for themselves when they were, uncomfortable, or if something bothered them. They would give him the signals too, just as they do to me when something is off for them, or they don't like a particular, conversation, or whatever the challenge is in the moment, right? But to be able to step back and recognize that they had their own relationship, and for me to support them both. If they came and said, I'm having a hard time, letting dad know this, I would help them figure out ways. Or if my husband came to me with the same kinds of concerns, I'm not connecting with one child or whatever, I could help them. But to step back and let them have their own relationship was really freeing. And it really just opened up the atmosphere at home too.
Yes, I definitely, I definitely can remember in the beginning sort of looking at every interaction and thinking, oh, that's not radical unschooling. And and I think that goes back to that initial sense that we can sometimes have of, oh, we're choosing this drastically different path. We have to do it perfectly. Or everyone's going to judge us. And so recognizing when we're more worried about the judgment of others as well, then we are concerned with our own health and functioning as a family, was helpful for me too, I think.
Yeah, those are two great things that I want to mention again, because they're so important. This idea of feeling judged, like you need to be perfect, right? That you have this vision of what unschooling is supposed to look like perfectly, and you're always trying to match that, and you're beating yourself up. That takes you out of the moment, which makes the whole process even more difficult, right? That vision of perfection really just, it really gets in the way. Life isn't perfect,
Exactly.
And to expect, what, when you first read about unschooling, I remember, I think I wrote this somewhere, it feels so utopian, right? Oh, you mean I can have a wonderful, loving relationship with my children, and we can do the things that we want, and we make choices and all this kind of stuff. You go, oh, wow, that sounds perfect. And then you start living it, and it's not. because life happens, right? And that is it. That was a huge learning piece for me. It's like, oh, I'm not like striving and striving and striving to get to this perfect place and then life's going to be wonderful. Oh, gee, life is every single day. Life is all these things coming up, all these moments, moving through them. I'm living fully now. I think that was part of why I ended up calling my website Living Joyfully, because it's not because life is perfect and we ignore everything else. It's because life is really in every single one of those moments, perfect or not, right?
Yeah. And I think that that makes me think too of moving away from sort of a normalized definition of success or successful, because I think that points to a goal in the future. And I don't necessarily think that unschooling works as a goal, because everything is constantly changing and you're trying to look at where you're at now and how you can support the individual that you're engaging with now, the teenager that Joseph is right now, as opposed to the successfully unschooled adult that I'm hoping to have, which is thankfully not an image that I have in my head, but I could see it being really a struggle if you still had an idea of what successful unschooling looked like.
Yeah, well, and you can see that and absolutely appreciate so many people who come to unschooling. Like, I mean, there was a question on my Facebook page just the other week, what about college? What about college? Because that is still kind of the goal that everybody sees in their head for raising their child, right? Can we get to this goal with this path? And you're right, having future goals interferes with unschooling in that even subconsciously you're trying to direct things towards this goal, right? And by trying to direct things, you're interfering and not letting them flow where they're going to flow, and where they flow is where unschooling is going to be the strongest in the end.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to finish up, what was the other thing? Because I had said two things. Oh, the feeling of feeling defensive if your spouse or your partner has concerns. Oh, I totally remember that feeling of, well, it must be my fault. You have a question. You're worried about something. Well, it's my fault because I'm kind of doing this for us, right? I spent a lot of time, taking that beat. Before responding, to take that beat, to realize that, no, this is just a question. It's not a judgment. And you know what? Even if it is a judgment, responding in that way defensively isn't going to help him move past it. Right? So in the end, I realized it was even irrelevant whether or not it was meant as an accusation or meant as a pure question. The most helpful response was to assume positive intent and move forward from there.
So I have to jump onto the assume positive intent. That is something Joe and I use as sort of a catchphrase. And we like to say, this house is an apiary, because apiary starts with API, which is assume positive intent. So it's always a work in progress. But that is something that helps remind us, just as, a couple, when we get a little touchy about one another's questions, like, hey, how about we assume positive intent and go from there?
Oh, I love it. I love it. Okay, let's move to our last question.
Okay.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the transition from deschooling and to unschooling. And for me, it was pretty seamless. In fact, I think, because for me anyway, part of the deschooling process actually took me to a place where I was no longer worried about calling what we were doing unschooling. We were living life together as a family. We come to see that we're always learning, and we're going to continue learning all our lives. And we're always growing. We're always changing. So it was just, I remember, I think I was sitting in the basement at one point and we were just doing our stuff, having fun. And I realized, hey, I'm not uncomfortable. I really get what they're doing. We're all doing our stuff. I think we can probably call this unschooling now. And that was that, and on we went with our day. So I was wondering if you could describe your transition from the actively learning phase of deschooling to the living phase of unschooling.
Well, I think my first reaction to this question was a feeling of humor, because I said, I think that transition was so seamless that, jumping back to one of the earlier questions, I couldn't even remember any worries that I'd had when we initially started.
Yeah.
So, I think I can't remember a particular, let's see, I don't remember a particular point, but I do remember the feeling of, oh, I don't need to read any more books, or really plow through, tons of Facebook posts to make sure I'm doing it right. And I didn't feel a strong need to attend conferences in order to seek more outside validation for what we were doing. Because this is almost an echo of what you just said. It just feels like we're just three people who are living together, and we're flowing through ups and downs, and we're just living through them. And so it doesn't feel like we're making a particular educational choice anymore. It's still the sort of the response I use when people ask about school. Oh, we're homeschooling, depending on the individual asking. But it doesn't really feel like that anymore to us. I think we're just living how we live. And for myself, I would say I've seen sort of the gifts of having chosen this path so many times now, that even when I do come up against worries or fears, I have just the tools of communicating with someone I love that let me move past those. And so there's so much trust in us as a family of three that I don't, it doesn't, I would agree. It doesn't really feel like, oh, we're unschooling. It's just, we're just living, and it's working even when there are challenges.
Yeah, I think that's really it. When you first start, you want to get to unschooling. It's like, okay, there's this deschooling phase. How long does it have to be? How many times have we answered? Well, typically it's a month for every year in school. And you've been in school longer, probably, as the parent than your child. So it's probably going to be the longest for you, because it helps to have something concrete at first to hang on to, right? Those are like little life vests or whatever. But I really do think eventually, when it comes to make sense, that goal just kind of drops away. And your point that what replaces it is that trust, that trust that you guys can, even when challenges come up, and they will. I mean, challenges come up to us as adults. Challenges will come up to our kids, no matter what age they are. Those are life things, not school versus unschooling kinds of things, right? And just that trust, and as we were talking before, that relationship, that connection, that we can use those things to move through. I think that it's that level of comfort and trust in that, we can get through whatever comes up, that helps us get to that place.
Yeah.
Yay. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Jen. I had an amazing time.
This was so fun.
And before we go, I just wanted to ask you where the best place for people to connect with you online is.
I do. I would point people to a blog that I've kept up less recently, but has quite a few glimpses of our life over the past many years at mybeamishboy.blogspot.com.
Yeah, I love reading that. Whenever I see you post, I've got something new there. Oh yeah, there I go. Well, thank you very much, Jen, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Oh, thank you, Pam. I hope you do too.
Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. You can also get your free Exploring Unschooling ebook at livingjoyfully.ca/exploring unschooling. If you'd like to connect, you can also find me on Facebook at Living Joyfully. Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.